Neighbors laughed when he built a shed all around his house. Until his firewood was always dry, it was a chilly fall morning in a small rural town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. The protagonist, a quiet man named Tom, had lived in his modest house at the edge of the town for as long as anyone could remember. The house itself wasn't anything special, a small cottage made of weathered wood and a slanted roof that seemed to always sag a little, no matter how much it was patched up. But it was home. The kind of place where you knew exactly how the light would shine through the kitchen window at sunrise, where every creaky floorboard felt like an old friend, and where the smell of fresh pine wood always seemed to hang in the air. Tom had always been a bit of an outsider in the town. While other people filled their lives with chatter and busy talk, Tom was quiet. He liked the stillness, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, and the way the wind would whistle through the trees. But that stillness was often broken by something much more frustrating. It was the cold, the biting chill that seemed to creep into his bones no matter how many blankets he piled up at night. The firewood he stacked next to his house, which he had carefully chopped and stored throughout the warmer months, never seemed to stay dry enough for the harsh winters. Every time winter approached, Tom found himself in a battle with the cold. The firewood he had spent weeks cutting and splitting often got damp from the rain, and that meant that when the snow arrived, it wouldn't burn properly. He tried everything, covering it with tarps, stacking it under trees, moving it inside, but nothing worked. Each year, he would have to fight the damp wood in his fireplace, struggling to get it to burn, cursing under his breath as it smoldered instead of blazing. The townspeople would see him trying to light his fire with wet logs and shake their heads, whispering about how he was always fighting a losing battle. No one seemed to understand his frustration. To them, the cold was just part of life, something you had to endure, not something you could fix. But Tom was different. He wasn't the kind of man to just accept things the way they were. He liked to solve problems. If something wasn't working, he'd tinker with it until it did. It was on one of these long, chilly evenings that Tom had an idea. He sat in front of his fireplace, watching the logs crackle and hiss, trying to get them to catch flame, when he noticed how the cold wind seemed to wrap itself around the house. There was a constant draft coming through the cracks in the walls and under the door. The house itself, as sturdy as it was, wasn't built to keep out the moisture that the rain and snow brought. He thought about it for a while, sitting there in the low light, and then it hit him. Why not build something to protect the firewood and himself from the cold? What if he could somehow enclose the whole house in a structure that would keep the weather out and allow the wood to dry properly? It sounded a little crazy, but it also sounded like the perfect solution. If he could keep the firewood dry, then he would never have to fight with wet logs again. He began to think about how it could work. He'd build a shed around the house, something large enough to protect the wood but also serve as a kind of barrier against the weather. It wouldn't be just any shed, though. This shed would surround his entire house, leaving just enough space for him to walk between the walls and his front door. It would be like a giant protective shell, a shelter for his home and firewood. He imagined it would be made of sturdy wood, something that would blend in with the natural surroundings, but it would also be strong enough to keep the damp out. Tom smiled at the thought. It was a ridiculous idea, yes, but it made perfect sense to him. He could already picture the wood being stacked neatly, high and dry, and the warmth of the fire flickering in the hearth as the storm raged outside. He wasn't a builder, but he was a practical man, and he had the tools, the skills, and the patience to make it work. Why not try? The next morning, he started drawing up plans for the shed. He sketched out how he would build the structure, where the wood would go, and how he could make sure everything was properly insulated. He even thought about windows. He wanted to make sure the shed had enough ventilation so that the air inside wouldn't get musty, but not so much that the cold could creep in. He had no idea how long the project would take, but he was determined to see it through. The more he thought about it, the more excited he became. This could be the solution to all his problems. But as Tom started to gather the materials he would need, large beams of wood, nails, tools, something else started to happen. The neighbors, who had always watched Tom with a mix of curiosity and indifference, started to notice. First, they saw him stacking up large piles of lumber in his yard. Then they noticed him working on something near his front door. Slowly, the whispers began. "What in the world is he doing now? Building another shed? That's just ridiculous. You know, last winter his firewood was damp all season long. Maybe this will solve that problem, or maybe it's just another waste of time." The comments were subtle at first, but they grew louder. People didn't understand why Tom was doing this. He was a quiet man, not one for grand projects or extravagant displays. His house had always been simple, and his life had been even simpler. So why all of a sudden was he building a giant shed around his house? It seemed like madness to the others, but Tom didn't care. He had a vision. He could see the end result in his mind: a dry house, dry firewood, and a warm winter. He wasn't doing this for anyone else. This wasn't about impressing his neighbors. It was about solving a problem that had plagued him for years. So, with determination, he kept working. The first few days of building weren't easy. The weather was turning colder, and there were still plenty of doubters in the town who thought he had lost his mind. Some people even took to making jokes. "Hey, Tom, don't forget to put a window in your new house. Don't want to miss the view of the neighbors." They would laugh, thinking they were clever, but Tom ignored them. He just kept working day after day. He was driven by something more than the opinions of others. He was driven by the desire to make his life better, to overcome the challenges that the cold and dampness had imposed on him. As the days went by, more and more people gathered outside his house, watching in silence. They had stopped laughing, but they couldn't quite understand what he was doing. And they definitely didn't understand why he was so determined to finish the project, no matter how ridiculous it seemed. As the days turned into weeks, Tom's vision of a dry, warm home slowly began to take shape. The work was tough, but he didn't mind. He had always been someone who found peace in hard work. It gave him something to focus on, a sense of purpose that took his mind off the chill in the air and the doubting looks from the neighbors. The structure around his house started as nothing more than wooden beams, laid out in a careful pattern. The shed, which was going to wrap entirely around his home, was built from the ground up. Every piece of wood had to be measured, cut, and nailed into place, and Tom did it all by hand. He was meticulous, making sure that each piece fit perfectly. There was no room for error. The whole project depended on getting it right. At first, it was just a framework. The neighbors could see it taking form, though they didn't understand it. A few still watched from their windows, muttering to each other about what kind of man would waste his time on such an odd project. They whispered about Tom's strange idea, making fun of the way he was building something that seemed so unnecessary. They couldn't understand why anyone would go to all the trouble of building a giant shed around their house. "What is he thinking?" one of the neighbors asked, shaking their head. "It's just a waste of good lumber." He could have bought a small wood stove and saved himself the trouble. But Tom didn't care. He didn't care about their laughter or their skepticism. In his mind, this shed was more than just wood and nails. It was the solution to his problem. He had been living with the dampness for so long, struggling to get his firewood to burn, that the thought of finding a way out of it filled him with hope. The weather was turning colder now. The leaves had all but fallen from the trees, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. As Tom worked, his breath fogged in the air, and the ground beneath his boots became muddy and soft. He didn't mind getting dirty. The work was hard, but the satisfaction of seeing his idea come to life made it all worth it. Day by day, the shed grew larger. The wooden framework was now surrounded by sturdy walls, each one carefully constructed to keep out the moisture. The roof, made of thick planks of wood, was the last part to be completed. Tom worked tirelessly, his hands calloused from the effort, his back sore from the hours spent bending over. But with every beam he nailed into place, he grew more certain that this strange idea of his was going to work. At times, Tom would step back and admire the structure from a distance. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had a certain charm. It looked like a giant wooden box, built just to protect his home from the elements. There was no window or door, yet Tom was still working on those details, but it didn't matter. The frame was solid, and that was all he needed for now. Still, the whispers didn't stop. "He's really going through with it, huh?" one neighbor said as they walked by his house. "I thought it was just a passing fancy, but it looks like he's serious." Some of them laughed behind his back, imagining how ridiculous it would be when the shed was finally finished. They couldn't understand why Tom didn't just buy a new stove or get a better heating system for his home. But Tom knew that this shed would be different. It wasn't about buying more stuff. It was about taking control of the situation, about building something with his own hands that could finally solve the problem that had been bothering him for years. Every evening, when the sun began to set and the air grew colder, Tom would come inside his house, feeling the drafts cut through the walls. He'd sit by the fire, trying his best to get it to burn, watching the flames flicker weakly against the damp wood. It was a frustrating routine. Sometimes he could get the fire going for a little while, but more often than not, the wood would just smolder, sending out smoke but little heat. It was disheartening, to say the least, but Tom was determined. He knew that once the shed was finished, that would be the end of his troubles. The firewood would dry properly, and his house would stay warm. One afternoon, Tom's old friend Carl came by to check on the progress. Carl had been living in the town for as long as Tom and had always been more practical than Tom, always thinking things through before jumping into any project. "Well, Tom," Carl said, walking around the perimeter of the shed with his hands on his hips. "I'll give it to you, you're committed, but I've got to say this isn't what I would have done. What do you need all this for? A little firewood and a few blankets should get you through the winter." Tom smiled at his friend's concern. "I've tried that," he replied. "The wood's always damp no matter what I do. This shed will keep everything dry, and that means I'll have firewood that burns like it should." Carl shook his head, still skeptical. "I don't know, Tom. I've never seen anyone build something like this just for firewood." Tom didn't argue. He didn't need to. He knew that once the shed was finished and winter arrived, everyone would see the reason behind it. The skepticism would fade and his neighbors would understand. As the days went by, the work continued. Tom moved from one section of the shed to another, cutting wood, measuring and building, never stopping. The structure took shape, becoming more and more like the protective shell he had envisioned. With each day, he could see it coming together, and his confidence grew. But the neighbors still didn't understand. Every so often, one of them would stop by and ask what he was doing, only to shake their heads in disbelief when he explained his plan. It didn't matter to Tom, though. He didn't need their approval. He just needed this project to be done, so he could finally get rid of the damp, wet firewood that had made his winters so miserable. Tom had built many things in his life, but this was different. This shed was more than just a shelter for his home. It was a symbol of his determination. No matter what anyone said, he would see it through. He wasn't just building for warmth, he was building for peace of mind. And as the cold wind began to blow stronger, Tom knew that soon the shed would be finished. Soon he would have his dry firewood, and the long, harsh winters that had always plagued him would finally be bearable. The days that followed felt like a blur. Tom's hands were becoming rougher, his arms tired from the constant work, but he didn't stop. There was a fire inside him now, a fire that didn't come from the hearth but from his determination. Each time he looked at the growing structure around his home, he felt a sense of pride. The shed was taking shape, just as he had imagined. It wasn't just wood and nails anymore. It was a symbol of his resolve, a representation of his willingness to solve a problem that had caused him so much frustration for years. By now, the basic framework of the shed was complete. The walls stood tall, sturdy, and strong, enclosing Tom's house in a protective embrace. The roof had been nailed into place, covering his home entirely, just as he had envisioned. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, the idea had seemed so impossible, so crazy. And yet here it was, a reality. The structure was functional and solid, though it wasn't quite finished. There was still a lot of work to do. Tom stepped back to admire his progress. The shed had a certain charm to it now, even if the neighbors still thought it looked odd. From a distance, it almost seemed like a cozy, rustic cabin, though one built with a little extra protection. He had built it with care, making sure to leave enough space around the house to walk comfortably. The walls were tight, sealing out the dampness, while the roof was designed to allow any rain to slide off and away. But the best part, of course, was the firewood. Tom had already started moving the stacks of wood into the shed. He stacked them high, arranging the logs in neat piles, each one carefully organized. The shed was now more than just a barrier against the cold. It was a storage space for the firewood that would keep his home warm throughout the long winter. He could already imagine the satisfaction of lighting a fire using dry, seasoned wood. No more wet logs that barely sparked. No more frustration as he sat in front of the fire, trying to coax a flame from damp, stubborn wood. This shed would change everything. As the weather continued to turn colder, the work on the shed began to feel more urgent. The nights were getting longer, and the chill in the air was beginning to bite. Tom could feel the frost in the air each morning when he woke up, and he knew that winter was coming. It was the time of year that had always given him the most trouble, but this time, things were going to be different. This time, he wouldn't be struggling with damp firewood, desperately trying to keep warm. He spent the next few days finishing up the last details. There were still some gaps in the shed that needed sealing, some loose boards that needed to be nailed down. Tom worked methodically, making sure that everything was in place. He knew that if he rushed now, he might miss something important. The whole purpose of the shed was to keep the dampness out, and if he wasn't thorough, the whole project might be a waste. So he worked slowly but steadily, checking every corner, every nail, and every board. The neighbors, who had been watching from a distance, started to take notice of how close Tom was to finishing. They could see the shed's final shape, and though some of them still thought it was an odd sight, they had to admit that it was starting to make sense. As Tom worked, a few of them came closer to get a better look, peering over the edge of the structure to see how it was coming along. One neighbor, Mrs. Harrison, a woman who lived a few houses down, had always been one of the more vocal critics of Tom's project. She had watched him from the beginning, shaking her head at his ambitious plans. She had thought it was a waste of time, even said once, "Why build a shed around your house when a new stove would do the trick? What's the point of all that work?" But as Mrs. Harrison stood at the edge of the yard, watching Tom put the finishing touches on his creation, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity. The shed didn't look as ridiculous as it once had. In fact, it looked solid, practical even. And she had to admit that, for the first time, she could see the logic in it. She knew how hard it could be to get firewood to burn when it was damp, how frustrating it could be to sit by a smoky fire, trying to warm up. Maybe, just maybe, Tom wasn't as crazy as she had thought. A few more days passed, and Tom was almost done. The shed was now fully sealed, with no gaps or cracks. The firewood was stacked neatly inside, organized and ready for use. Tom had even placed a small door in the shed, a wooden hatch that would allow him to get in and out easily without exposing the firewood to the elements. The shed was complete, and now it was time to test it. Tom moved the last of his firewood into the shed and stood back to take a final look. He felt a sense of satisfaction, a quiet pride in his work. The neighbors had stopped laughing a while ago, though some still whispered among themselves. They were starting to understand, even if they hadn't yet admitted it. Winter was coming and Tom was ready. He could already picture the warmth of his house, the fire burning brightly in the hearth, the crackle of dry logs filling the air. For the first time in years, he wouldn't have to fight with wet wood. The shed had worked. It had protected his firewood from the rain, the snow, and the damp ground. The air inside the shed was dry, just as he had hoped, and the wood was ready for use. The morning after he finished the shed, Tom awoke to a cold, crisp day. He could feel the frost on the windows, the unmistakable sign that winter had arrived. But inside his house, it was warm. The fire had been going strong all night, thanks to the dry wood from his shed. He had used some of the wood the evening before, and it had burned brilliantly, crackling and popping in the hearth. He had never seen a fire burn so well. As he sat by the fire, sipping his morning coffee, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. The shed had worked. It had done exactly what he had hoped it would. No more wet wood, no more cold, miserable winters. Tom had solved his problem, and he had done it on his own terms with his own hands. The work had been hard, but it had been worth it. And as the days grew colder and winter settled in, Tom knew that his home would stay warm. His neighbors, though they still didn't fully understand his project, had to admit that he had been right all along. The shed wasn't just a strange idea, it was the solution to a problem that had plagued them all. They didn't have to say it out loud, but Tom could see it in their eyes. They respected him now, even if they never fully understood why he had built the shed in the first place. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Tom smiled to himself. The long winter ahead didn't seem so difficult anymore. The winter that followed was unlike any Tom had experienced before. For the first time in years, he didn't have to struggle with damp firewood. The shed he had built around his house had done exactly what he'd hoped it would. The wood, carefully stacked and stored in the dry, insulated shed, burned beautifully. The fire crackled and roared, filling the house with warmth, while the cold winds howled outside. Tom felt a deep sense of satisfaction every time he stoked the fire, knowing that his hard work had paid off. The first few days of winter had been unusually cold, even by the standards of the small town. Snow blanketed the ground and the temperature dropped to near freezing at night. But inside Tom's house, it was warm and inviting. He had a constant supply of dry wood, stacked neatly in the shed, ready to fuel the fire. Each night he'd go outside, open the small wooden hatch on the shed, and pull out a log or two. The wood was perfectly dry, and it burned without struggle. There were no more smoky, frustrating nights spent trying to get damp wood to catch fire. As the days went on, Tom's neighbors began to notice the difference. They had always been used to struggling with their own firewood, especially when the weather was so wet. Most of them had to keep their wood covered with tarps, hoping that the rain wouldn't soak through. Even then, it was rare to find wood that would burn easily. But Tom's firewood, neatly stored in his shed, was always dry, always ready to burn. One evening, as Tom was coming back from the shed with another load of firewood, he noticed that a few of his neighbors were gathered at the edge of his yard. They were standing together, talking quietly, their breath visible in the frigid air. Tom hesitated for a moment, unsure if they were still skeptical of his shed or if they had finally come to understand its purpose. But then, as he approached, he heard one of them speak. "Well, I'll be darned," Mrs. Harrison said, a note of surprise in her voice. "I never thought I'd say this, but Tom was right. His firewood burns better than ours ever has." Tom smiled to himself, though he didn't say anything. He could hear the others agreeing, murmuring about how warm his house must be with dry wood burning so efficiently. They had always known him as the quiet, eccentric man who liked to do things his own way, but now they were beginning to see the results of his strange idea. That evening, as the temperature plummeted, Tom sat by his fire, feeling the heat radiate from the hearth. The flames danced in the fireplace, their warmth spreading throughout the room. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside it was calm and cozy. For the first time in a long while, Tom felt like he was in control. The cold winter was no longer something to dread. He had solved the problem that had plagued him for years. The next morning, the sun rose weakly behind the clouds, casting a soft, golden light over the snow-covered ground. Tom made his way to the shed again, this time with a sense of purpose. He had learned how to take care of his firewood, how to keep it dry and ready to burn, and now he was ready to share what he had learned with others. He wasn't the type to boast or call attention to himself, but he had to admit that there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that he had figured out something others hadn't. He had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed in the background, working on his own ideas without looking for approval. But now, as he loaded up his wheelbarrow with dry firewood, he felt a quiet pride. His neighbors were starting to see that what he had done wasn't so crazy after all. It had worked. The shed, which they had once mocked, had solved a problem for him, and now, it seemed, it was solving problems for them too. Over the next few days, more and more neighbors came to visit Tom. They would stand by the shed, watching as he pulled firewood from the dry stacks, asking questions about how he had built it. Some of them, especially those who had struggled with damp wood in the past, were eager to learn more. Tom didn't mind explaining. He had built the shed to solve his own problem, but now that it had worked, he was happy to help others. He showed them how he had designed it, how the walls were sealed to keep moisture out, and how the roof was slanted to allow rain and snow to slide off. He even offered to help them build their own sheds if they wanted. But most of his neighbors, still skeptical, just watched from a distance. They had to see it for themselves before they would believe it. Tom didn't mind. He was patient. He had always been patient. He knew that eventually they would all come around. The results spoke for themselves. As the weeks went on, the town experienced one of the coldest winters in years. The snow piled up and the wind picked up speed, howling through the streets. But inside Tom's house, it was warm. He kept the fire burning steadily, using the dry wood he had stacked in his shed. The fire crackled and popped, providing a constant source of warmth that kept the cold at bay. Every time he threw a log on the fire, he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had solved his own problem, and now his home was as warm as he had always wanted it to be. One evening, a heavy snowstorm swept through the town. The wind was fierce, and the snow fell in thick, swirling flakes. It was the kind of storm that would have made it difficult for anyone to keep warm in the past. But Tom didn't worry. He had more than enough dry firewood to last him through the worst of it. As the snow piled up outside, he sat by the fire, feeling the warmth seep into his bones. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the sting of the cold. The shed had done its job, and he had done his. As the storm raged on, Tom realized something important. He had spent so many years struggling with the dampness, fighting with the cold, and feeling like he was never quite in control of his own home. But now, thanks to the shed, things were different. He had taken a problem and solved it on his own terms. No one had helped him. He had built the shed by hand with his own 2 hands, and now he was reaping the rewards. The cold didn't bother him anymore. The wind didn't worry him. He was warm, safe, and comfortable in his own home. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside it was peaceful. The fire burned brightly, casting a soft glow across the room. Tom sat back in his chair, letting the warmth wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt completely at ease. The days that followed were calm and quiet. The town, blanketed in snow, seemed to slow down during the long winter. People stayed inside more, gathered around their fires and tried to keep warm. But for Tom, the harsh weather no longer felt like an enemy. It had become a backdrop to a life that was finally at peace. He spent his days by the fire, reading, enjoying the warmth that filled his home, and listening to the wind howl outside. There was a sense of comfort now, a sense of security that had been missing for so many years. His neighbors, who had once laughed and whispered about his project, had slowly started to understand the quiet brilliance of what he had done. The first few weeks of winter had been a real test, and Tom had passed it with flying colors. While others struggled with damp wood that wouldn't burn, Tom's firewood was always dry, always ready to burn brightly. His house was warm, and his fire never went out. The satisfaction he felt every time he added another log to the fire was unmatched. It wasn't just the warmth that brought him peace. It was the knowledge that he had solved a problem that had plagued him for so long. As the winter days grew shorter and the snow continued to fall, Tom started to notice something interesting. More and more people from the town came by to see his shed. They came to admire the work he had done, to ask questions about how he had built it, and to learn from his success. The skepticism that had once surrounded the project was gone. Now people were genuinely curious, and some of them were even considering building their own sheds. They had watched Tom's fire burn steadily throughout the winter, and they could see that it wasn't just luck. The shed had worked. It had kept the firewood dry, and it had kept his house warm. It had solved the problem that had stumped so many people in the town for years. Tom was always willing to share his knowledge. He didn't boast about his project, nor did he try to prove that he was right all along. He simply showed people what he had done and explained how the shed had helped him. He showed them how he had sealed the walls to keep moisture out, how the roof was slanted to allow the snow to slide off, and how the firewood was stacked carefully to allow air to circulate. It wasn't a complicated system, but it worked, and that's what mattered most. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Mrs. Harrison came over to Tom's house. She had been one of the loudest critics when he first started building the shed, but now her attitude had changed. She had seen for herself how well the shed had worked. She had even started building one in her own yard. She smiled as she approached Tom, holding a basket of fresh bread in her hands. "Tom," she said, her voice warm with gratitude, "I have to admit I was wrong. I thought you were crazy for building that shed, but I see now that you were right. My firewood is burning so much better, and my house is warmer than it's ever been. I can't thank you enough." Tom smiled and took the basket from her. "I'm just glad it's working for you," he said simply. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because I wanted a better winter." Mrs. Harrison nodded, still amazed at how simple the solution had been. "You've changed the way we think about winter," she said. "I'm sure others will follow your lead." And she was right. Over the next few weeks, more people in the town started building their own sheds. Some of them came to Tom for advice, asking how to make their sheds work as well as his. Tom was always happy to help, showing them the details that made all the difference. Some of his neighbors even invited him over to see their progress, and Tom was proud to see that his idea had spread. It wasn't just about the firewood anymore. It was about a community coming together to solve a problem, a community that had once laughed at him now learning from him. Winter continued to unfold, but for Tom, it no longer felt like a struggle. He had learned how to make his own home a warm and comfortable place, and now he was helping others do the same. As the snow piled up outside, Tom's fire burned brightly inside. He had built something that worked, and more importantly, he had shown others how to build it too. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had made a difference was something Tom carried with him every day. He hadn't set out to become a hero or a leader. He had just wanted to solve a problem that no one else seemed to care about. But in the process, he had helped the whole town. He had turned an ordinary winter into something extraordinary, not with grand gestures or flashy ideas, but with a simple, practical solution that anyone could understand. As the season drew to a close and the days began to grow longer, Tom looked around his home. The fire was still going strong, the wood was dry, and the warmth filled every corner of the room. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of earth that had been hidden under the white blanket for months. It was the end of winter, and Tom knew that the coming spring would bring new challenges, but he was no longer worried. The shed had taught him an important lesson. No matter how difficult things seemed, there was always a way to find a solution. You just had to be willing to think differently, to take the time to build something that would last. He walked outside and stood by the shed, looking at the sturdy walls that had protected him and his firewood all winter. It wasn't the most elegant structure in the world, but it had done its job. And now, as he watched the sun dip below the horizon, he knew that he had built something that would last, something that would help him for years to come. The neighbors who had once laughed and doubted him now respected him. They had seen the results for themselves. And as Tom stood there in the soft light of the evening, he couldn't help but feel a quiet pride in what he had accomplished. He had taken a simple idea and turned it into something that had changed his life and the lives of those around him. Tom hadn't needed anyone's approval. He hadn't needed anyone to tell him that his idea was worth pursuing. He had trusted his instincts, worked hard, and built something that worked, and that, in the end, was all that mattered.